There are stories that begin with greatness. There are stories that begin with warning. This one begins with both. In a quiet land far from war and kings, there was born a child unlike any other. His name was Narcissus. From the moment he entered the world, something felt different. Not wrong, not broken, but distant, as if he belonged to something that did not fully exist among others. Those who saw him could not explain what they felt. They only knew they could not look away. His beauty was not simple. It was not the kind that brought comfort. It was the kind that created silence. People would pause without knowing why. Words would fail before they were spoken. Even those who had seen many wonders found themselves unsure of what they were looking at. It was not just appearance. It was presence. Something about him felt complete in a way that left no space for anyone else. As he grew, this feeling did not fade. It deepened. Children around him laughed and formed bonds. They shared stories and small moments that gave meaning to their days. But Narcissus did not join them. Not because he could not, because he did not need to. He watched. He existed among them, but never with them. There was no cruelty in him yet. No rejection. No pride. Only distance. A distance that could not be crossed because it was not created by choice. It was simply there. Those who cared for him began to notice something else. He did not seek connection. He did not reach outward. He did not look for recognition. It was as if the world outside of him did not hold enough weight to matter. Concern grew quietly. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. And when uncertainty grows around something that cannot be explained, people turn to those who claim to understand what others cannot. So they brought the child to a seer, a figure who did not look at the world the way others did, a figure who listened for patterns that had not yet fully formed. The seer observed the child in silence, not with admiration, not with fear, with recognition. Then the words came, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. He will live a long life, only if he never knows himself. The room did not react at first, because meaning does not always arrive at the same time as words. But once it settled, something shifted. What does it mean to know oneself? How can a person avoid something that feels so natural? No one could answer. And the seer offered nothing more, because some warnings are not meant to be explained. They are meant to exist. As Narcissus continued to grow, the prophecy did not fade into memory. It lingered, not as something understood, but as something felt. A quiet weight beneath everything. His beauty continued to shape the world around him. Strangers would stop to look. Voices would soften in his presence. Attention followed him without effort. But still he remained separate. He did not respond to admiration. He did not seek approval. He did not reflect the feelings that others placed upon him. It was as if those feelings never reached him at all. Time passed, and what once seemed like harmless distance began to take on a different shape. Because distance does not stay neutral forever. It becomes something. It becomes absence. And absence has consequences. There were moments when others tried to reach him. Moments when connection was offered freely. Moments when kindness asked nothing in return. But each time it met the same quiet end. Not rejection with anger. Not rejection with words. But rejection through nothing. Through lack of response. Through the absence of recognition. And that absence hurt more than any insult could. Because it made those who reached out feel invisible. As if they had never been there at all. Narcissus did not notice this. Or if he did, it did not change him. Because to change something, one must first see it. And he did not see others clearly enough for their pain to exist in his world. The prophecy remained, unspoken now, but present. He will live long, only if he never knows himself. At the time, it seemed like a strange condition, a distant idea with no clear meaning. But slowly, without anyone realizing it, the path toward that meaning had already begun, and the world had already started to shape itself around it. Because some fates do not arrive suddenly. They unfold quietly, step by step, until the moment they can no longer be avoided. Time moved forward without asking permission. Narcissus grew older. His presence became more defined. What once was a child became something that others could no longer ignore. Wherever he walked, attention followed him. Not because he demanded it, but because it existed around him naturally. People spoke his name more often now. Sometimes with admiration. Sometimes with confusion. Sometimes with something closer to longing. Yet he remained unchanged in how he responded. Or more precisely in how he did not respond. He did not lean into the attention. He did not reject it loudly either. He simply did not need it, as if it belonged to another world entirely. At first, this created fascination. People believed distance meant mystery, and mystery often invites pursuit. So they tried. Some approached him with kindness, some with open admiration, some with words carefully chosen to build connection. But every attempt met the same outcome. No return, no reflection, no acknowledgement that anything had been offered at all. It was not cruelty in action. It was absence of reaction. And absence can feel heavier than resistance. Those who tried began to feel something shift inside them. Not anger at first, not even disappointment, but confusion, a quiet disorientation, as if their own presence had been questioned, as if they were speaking into space that did not confirm they existed. Narcissus did not notice this change, or if he did, it did not hold meaning for him. Because meaning requires recognition of another mind, and his world did not often include that recognition. Inside him there was no desire to harm, no intention to wound, no decision to reject, only a lack of connection that felt natural to him, as natural as breathing. But for others, it became something different. Stories began to form around him. whispers of a boy who could not be reached, who could not be touched emotionally, who walked through admiration as if it were wind. Love began to form around him anyway, because love does not always require return to exist. It only requires direction. And in that growing imbalance, something began to take shape that would eventually change everything. Among those who were drawn to him was someone who felt the distance more sharply than the rest. Echo. She did not approach him in the same way others did. Not because she was braver, but because she was already broken in a different way. She had once had her voice, once had her own words, once had her ability to speak freely. But that was taken from her, leaving only fragments, only repetition, only echoes of what others say. She could hear him, she could see him, but she could not truly reach him in any normal way. Yet still she followed. Not loudly, not directly, but always nearby, listening, waiting. As Narcissus moved through the world unaware of what he left behind, Echo remained within the edges of his presence. A voice without origin, a longing without expression. And slowly something inside her began to form that had no outlet. Love. Not simple admiration. Not curiosity. But something deeper. Something that needed return to survive. And Narcissus remained as he always was, unaware that anything had changed at all. The distance between them was not physical. It was structural. He existed in a world where others reached outward. She existed in a world where reaching outward meant nothing could be created from it. Two forms of isolation moving closer without ever truly meeting. And the space between them began to tighten, not through action, but through inevitability. Because when one side cannot be heard, and the other cannot reflect, something must eventually break. Even if neither of them understands what that breaking will look like. The world continued to move, but something in it began to lean towards silence. Echo existed at the edge of that silence. She watched Narcissus from a distance, not close enough to be seen, not far enough to disappear. She had no control over her voice. Only fragments remained. She could only repeat what others said. Nothing more. When she first saw him, she did not speak. She could not speak freely anyway. But even if she could, she might not have known what to say. Because some feelings do not form words easily. They form pressure instead. A need to be understood without translation. She followed him quietly, through forests, through open paths, through places where people gathered and left behind their attention. Narcissus never noticed her, not once. To him, she was not absent. She was simply not there. But Echo was there, always there, listening, learning the shape of him through distance alone. She began to understand something painful. He did not turn away from people. He simply did not register them as something that needed response. That realization did not bring anger. It brought something softer, something worse. Hope. Hope is dangerous when it has no foundation, because it begins to grow without permission. And Echo's hope began to grow in silence. One day, Narcissus spoke aloud, a simple call into the forest. Echo heard it. She repeated it, not because she chose to, but because that was all she could do. His voice reached her first, then returned to him altered. He stopped. He looked around, confused. He called again. Echo repeated it again, closer this time. Narcissus frowned. He did not understand what he was hearing. He assumed someone was near, someone hiding, someone playing with him. So he called out again, this time with frustration. Echo repeated it, now closer still. Then she stepped forward, slowly, carefully, hoping that presence might explain what words could not. Narcissus finally saw her. She moved toward him with everything she had, but she had nothing to offer except repetition. She tried to form meaning. She tried to express what she felt, but every attempt returned only fragments. Broken reflection of his words. He spoke again. She answered again. And in that moment, misunderstanding became complete. Narcissus felt something else instead of recognition. Confusion turned into discomfort. Discomfort turned into rejection. He did not understand her condition. He only experienced the echo of himself. And he turned away, not with violence, not with hatred, but with dismissal, a simple refusal to engage further. That was enough. Echo froze. Something inside her collapsed without sound. She reached out again, but nothing changed. The distance between them did not shift, because it was never physical. It was structural. He could not receive what she was offering, and she could only offer what could not be received. Narcissus left, without looking back. Echo remained where she stood, her presence fading into something less defined, her voice no longer carrying anything new, only repetition of what had already been lost. What remained of her did not disappear fully. It scattered into sound, into memory, into the spaces where words once tried to become connection. And from that moment onward, she was no longer a person in the same way. Only an echo, waiting in places where voices failed to return. And somewhere far ahead, Narcissus continued walking, unaware that something had just broken behind him. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. After Echo faded from his path, something changed in the air around Narcissus. Not visibly, not in any way he could notice, but the world around him no longer felt the same. The forest no longer answered his presence with the same ease. The spaces he moved through felt slightly emptier, not because anything had left, but because something had stopped trying to reach him. Echo did not return. What remained of her no longer had direction, only repetition, only fragments of sound that no longer formed intention. And even that began to fade into the background of things no one notices anymore. Narcissus continued his life as before. He did not question what had happened. Because to question something, it must first register as meaningful. For him, it did not. People still approached him. Some still admired him from afar. But something subtle had shifted. Their hope carried less certainty now, as if something had proven that reaching him was not just difficult. It might be impossible. That idea spread quietly, not through words, through experience. And experience is more convincing than explanation. Narcissus remained untouched by this change. He still did not reflect others. He still did not return what was given to him. It was not a decision. It was a state. But in the world around him, something else began to move. Not openly, not clearly, but with intention. There are forces that do not respond immediately to harm. They wait. They observe. They measure imbalance over time. And when imbalance becomes too stable, it begins to correct itself. Slowly, quietly, without announcement. This is where attention shifted towards something beyond human interaction. Something older. Something that does not act from emotion, but from equilibrium. The presence of Nemesis is not loud. It does not appear with warning. It arrives through consequence, through patterns that become too one-sided to remain unchanged. Narcissus had become a point of imbalance, not because he acted with cruelty, but because nothing returned from him at all. No recognition, no reflection, no exchange, only constant outward attention directed toward him, and nothing moving back. That kind of imbalance does not remain unnoticed forever. So the world shifted slightly around him again. Subtle at first, a feeling of distance that was no longer emotional, but structural, as if the environment itself was preparing something that had not yet been revealed. Narcissus did not feel this preparation. He simply continued, walking through the world as he always had, unaware that the conditions around him were slowly narrowing into something unavoidable. There is a moment in every story where silence stops being absence and becomes expectation. That moment was approaching, and Narcissus was already inside it, without knowing, without resisting, without even the concept that anything around him had begun to change. Because some transformations do not announce themselves. They only become visible when it is already too late to avoid them. Something in the world began to narrow. Not physically, not in shape, but in possibility. Narcissus continued walking without awareness of what was forming around him. The air grew still in certain places. The light seemed to settle differently on the ground. Even water began to appear calmer than before. Not peaceful, calmer in a way that felt deliberate, as if the world itself was waiting. He came upon a quiet place, a hidden pool. The surface was smooth, undisturbed. It reflected the sky above with unnatural clarity. Narcissus stopped, not because he understood why, but because something about it demanded attention. He looked into the water. At first, there was nothing unusual. Just shape, just color, just reflection. Then he saw him. A face, perfectly formed, unmoving, looking back at him. He did not recognize it as himself. Not immediately. It felt separate, like another presence existing beneath the surface. He tilted his head slightly. The reflection mirrored him. Exactly. Perfectly. He lifted a hand. The reflection lifted a hand. Something inside him shifted. Not fear, not understanding. Something closer to fascination. He had never seen anything respond to him so directly. Without delay. Without absence. He leaned closer. The image did not break. It remained. Waiting. Responding. Narcissus felt something he had never felt before. Connection. Or what he believed was connection. He spoke softly. The reflection moved. He spoke again. It responded again. But there were no words returned. Only movement. Only presence. Only perfect alignment with his own actions. He did not realize what he was seeing. He did not realize it was not another person. It was him. But recognition requires a mirror within the mind. And he had never needed one before. So it did not form. He stayed there longer. Minutes turned into something that no longer felt like time. The world behind him stopped mattering. The world in front of him had collapsed into a single point. The reflection. It did not reject him. It did not ignore him. It did not leave. It stayed. Always there. Always responding. For the first time in his life, something gave him what others never had. Attention that never vanished. Presence that never turned away. He reached toward it again. Slowly. Carefully. The water trembled slightly. But the image remained. He did not understand why it felt so complete. Why it felt so right. Why nothing else in his life had ever felt like this. And yet something in him began to stop moving away. He stayed longer, closer, more still with each passing moment. The rest of the world began to fade behind him. Not because it disappeared, but because it no longer mattered. Only this mattered. Only this presence that could not leave him. Only this reflection that never rejected him. He did not know he had already crossed a line. One that could not be stepped back from. Because what he was looking at was not another being. It was the only thing in the world that had ever perfectly matched him. And that was the beginning of the end. The world behind Narcissus began to disappear. Not physically, but in importance. He did not leave the pool. Not fully. Not anymore. Each return became shorter. Each departure became less certain. The reflection waited for him, always unchanged, always present, always answering. He began to understand it in a new way, not as a stranger, not as an object, but as something that belonged to him, something that moved with him, something that existed only when he existed. He spoke more often now. Soft words, careful words, words meant for something that never interrupted. The reflection answered every movement, every expression, every pause, perfectly, without delay, without refusal. It never turned away. It never left. That certainty began to replace everything else. People no longer mattered in the same way. Their voices felt distant. Their attention felt unstable. Their presence felt unreliable. But the reflection did not change. It did not leave. It did not reject. It remained. And that became enough. Days passed in a way that no longer felt structured. Time became something measured only by how long he could stay before his body forced him away. But even then he always returned. Closer each time. Longer each time. The boundary between himself and the water began to weaken. Not in reality, but in perception. He stopped thinking of the reflection as something separate. It felt like agreement, like harmony, like a truth that had always been waiting for him. He reached out more often now, not to test, but to connect. The surface rippled every time, yet the image always returned, unbroken, unchanged, perfect. He did not notice the change in himself, how his thoughts narrowed, how his world reduced, how everything not tied to the reflection slowly lost meaning. There was no outside pressure anymore, no rejection, no silence from others, only this constant return, only this perfect response. And in that perfection, something dangerous formed. Desire without interruption, attention without limit, connection without resistance. It felt like peace, but it was not peace. It was containment. He stayed longer than he should have. He stopped eating when he should have left. He ignored exhaustion when it arrived, because leaving meant breaking the only thing that ever truly responded to him. And that felt impossible. The reflection had become more than a sight. It had become a need, something that filled the space where everything else had once failed. He no longer asked what it was. He no longer questioned why it existed. He only knew that it stayed. And that was enough to keep him there. Closer. Still. Unmoving. Until the rest of the world no longer felt like a world at all. Only a place he visited briefly between moments with the water. And slowly even those visits stopped feeling necessary. Because everything he needed was already in front of him. Always waiting. Always him. The boundary between presence and obsession begins to dissolve. Narcissus no longer visits the pool. He remains near it. The world outside feels increasingly distant. Not far away, just irrelevant. The reflection does not change. It does not grow tired. It does not turn away. It stays, always responding, always perfect. That consistency becomes his center. Everything else becomes noise. He no longer wonders what time it is. He no longer measures days. Only moments near the water matter now. He begins to speak less to the world and more to the reflection. At first, it feels like dialogue. Then it feels like alignment. Then it stops feeling like two things at all. He notices details he never saw before. The way the reflection moves when he moves. The way it pauses when he pauses. The way it waits exactly as he waits. It feels alive in the only way that matters to him. Responsive. Present. Never absent. He begins to believe something that does not arrive as a thought, but as a certainty, that this is the only place where he is truly seen. Not judged. Not rejected. Not ignored. Seen. The outside world never offered that. Only this surface did. The idea of leaving begins to feel strange, unnatural, even threatening. Because leaving would mean returning to uncertainty, to silence, to absence. And absence now feels like something unbearable. He leans closer to the water more often, staying longer each time. The reflection becomes clearer in his mind than anything behind him. He stops noticing hunger fully. He stops noticing distance from others entirely. If others pass nearby, they no longer feel like participants in his world. They feel like interruptions that do not belong. But he does not respond to them. He does not need to. The reflection has replaced that need completely. There is no longer a difference between looking and belonging, between seeing and being seen, between self and image. Only continuity, only repetition, only perfect return. And yet something in that perfection begins to tighten, not breaking, not changing, just narrowing, like a space slowly closing around him without moving at all. He does not notice this shift because it does not feel like loss. It feels like focus. He is no longer scattered, no longer reaching outward. Everything is here now, contained, complete. And in that completion, he stops asking questions altogether. Because questions belong to a world that no longer feels necessary. Only the reflection remains. And it does not ask anything of him. It only stays. The world outside the water no longer reaches him. Not in meaning. Not in weight. Narcissus remains by the pool. The reflection remains with him. There is nothing else that feels real in the same way anymore. His body begins to weaken. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Slowly. Like time itself is withdrawing its support. He notices it only in fragments. A slower movement, a heavier breath, a longer pause between thoughts. But even those signs feel distant, less important than what is in front of him. The reflection still responds. It still mirrors him perfectly. It still exists exactly as it always has. That constancy becomes the only anchor he trusts. The outside world feels thinner each day. Voices that once existed around him no longer carry meaning. Even memory of them fades like something that belonged to another life. a life that no longer feels connected to this moment. He tries to move away once, but the absence of the reflection feels immediate, not emotional, structural, like something essential has been removed. He returns, always returns, because nothing else holds him in place anymore. There is no longer a distinction between choice and necessity. Only return, only repetition. The reflection never asks him to stay, but it never lets him leave either, because it is always there when he comes back, waiting in perfect silence. He begins to lose awareness of time again, but differently than before. Before time disappeared because it was unimportant. Now it disappears because it is unrecognizable. Days do not form memory anymore. They dissolve into continuous presence. He becomes quieter, not by intention, but by depletion. Even speech begins to feel heavier, less necessary. He speaks less often. And when he does, it feels like speaking into something that already knows the answer. The reflection continues to answer every movement, every shift of expression, every pause. But something inside him begins to blur. Not what he sees, but what he is. The line between observer and observed begins to thin. Not broken, not erased, just less certain. He no longer feels like someone standing outside the water. He feels closer to something inside it, something mirrored, something continuous. The world behind him fades further still, not because it disappears, but because it stops offering anything that feels real. Only the reflection remains consistent enough to hold attention. And attention is all that remains of his strength. There is a moment where he tries to remember something outside of this place. But the attempt does not form clearly. Faces, voices, places, they all feel like echoes of something that never fully belonged to him. Only the reflection feels complete. Only the reflection feels certain. And so he stays. Not because he chooses to, not because he resists, but because everything else has already begun to leave him. Quietly, gradually, without resistance, until only one thing remains stable enough to hold him in place. The image that never turns away. The presence that never disappears. The self that never stops responding. There comes a point where even longing becomes quiet. Not because it ends, but because it runs out of strength to continue in the same form. Narcissus remains at the water's edge. But now even that phrase feels uncertain. Remains suggests stability. And stability no longer exists in the same way. His body is no longer what it was. Not suddenly changed, but gently undone. As if the world has decided to release its hold on him piece by piece. The reflection is still there. It always is. Perfect. Unmoving in its return. But something about it feels different now. Not because it has changed, but because he has. He looks at it less as a discovery, and more as something far away, something that cannot come closer anymore. His thoughts are slower now. Not empty, just reduced, like a voice fading into distance that no longer responds when called. There is no fear in him, no resistance, only stillness. A stillness that no longer tries to hold anything together. The world behind him is gone in all ways that matter. Not erased, just unreachable. Even memory of it feels like it belongs to someone else. Someone who once moved freely without understanding what it meant to stay. The reflection remains. But even that begins to feel less like a companion, and more like a final image that refuses to leave. He does not reach for it anymore. There is no strength left in reaching. Only observation. Quiet. Final. Something soft begins to replace everything else. Not emotion. Not thought. Something closer to surrender. The boundary between him and the water dissolves completely now. Not in movement, but in meaning. There is no longer a clear separation between self and reflection. Only continuation. Only fading repetition of presence. And then even that begins to thin. The air around him grows still in a way that feels complete. Not empty, complete. As if the story has reached the point where nothing more needs to happen. And so nothing does. When others come later, they do not find what once stood there. They find only still water. And near it, something that no longer resembles a person. Not gone in violence, not taken by force, but changed into something quieter than disappearance. A flower. Simple, present, anchored where the reflection once held him. This is how Narcissus remains in the world. Not as a man who understood himself too late, but as something that grew from the place where understanding failed to arrive in time. A reminder left behind in still water. That beauty without connection becomes distance, and distance without return becomes disappearance. And somewhere in the silence that follows, even the reflection is no longer needed. Because nothing is left to be reflected. Only memory. Only story. Only what remains when someone looks too long into themselves.